and join me as I teach you how to make these 3D acorns. I have for you an inspiration photo that I'll pin to the top of the video and a line drawing that you can download to trace if you would like. Here are the colors that I use: olive green, sap green, moonglow, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and a little bit of orange. I'm going to be using a round 5, 4, and a 1 for this painting, but you really could use whatever brushes you like. And in the end, I'll show you a technique using the X-Acto knife, and we'll do a little bit of pen work in the end. All the supplies I used are listed in the description. I start off by wetting my acorns, just getting a nice little thin layer of water. We want our first base layer to be kind of a wet-on-wet technique. I'm using my cadmium yellow-orange. You really could use any orange you want. This base layer is just going to help the vibrancy. The orange will kind of pop through in little places, and it will really give this acorn dimension in the end. Sometimes if we were just to use the colors that we see in the picture and just use browns, it would just turn out really flat. So we just kind of need to add in this vibrant base layer. Now I'm going to put in my burnt sienna, just kind of watch that melt into the orange. Now I'm not copying my inspiration photo, I just kind of have it there to kind of show you that dimension and where the highlights are and the shape. So I have it there just as a reference, but I'm not going to try to make it look absolutely like the inspiration photo. Our first layers are just going to be this wet-on-wet technique. And now I'm taking a little bit of tissue and I'm just kind of tapping out where that highlight is. That orange still kind of peeks through, but we just want to keep that area highlighted. And I tapped on the top, and that kind of adds a little bit of a look of texture. I'm adding in a little bit of my raw sienna into that wet paint. I'm just going to deepen that burnt sienna. It's almost like the paint is mixing on the paper, but a little bit of each color just kind of peeks through, and it just adds a lot of dimension and a look of texture. While it's still wet, I'm just going to add in a little bit of my Moonglow and start making that shadow underneath. If you don't have Moonglow, it's a Daniel Smith color that I really love for shadows. But if you don't have that color, you could use like an indigo, you could use a purple, you could mix a few colors together. I tend to stay away from the neutral tint and Payne's gray. To me, they kind of dry flat. They're more of a dull color, and I just really enjoy this Daniel Smith because it creates such wonderful depth. I just took a little more tissue, tapped out where that highlight was going to be, and added a little more texture to the top. Let that first layer dry. Now I'm just adding in a little bit of water because I want this next layer to still go on softly. But we're just going to be adding in more of the dimension using some of that burnt sienna. This is how we get our 3D effect, is that we do a lot of layers, and each one just continues to make that depth, to show that curvature of the acorn. I decided to drop in a little more of my orange, keep that vibrancy going. It just kind of melts in there and just looks really soft. More of that Moonglow, kind of keep creating that shadow. With watercolor, when you're trying to get this 3D effect, it does take quite a few layers, so just be patient. It'll get there eventually. I'm just using my hairdryer to kind of speed up the process of drying. We're going to work on the top of our acorn. Just taking some of that raw sienna. I'm kind of just outlining a little bit where I've got that texture drawn. It almost kind of look like scales. Not quite sure what you call that on an acorn. Then I'm just tapping in a little bit of my burnt sienna into that raw sienna. We're going to be adding more detail later, but for now we're just kind of adding that first layer. Actually, we're adding our second layer of color and texture. Now we'll just kind of continue the same techniques over on our second acorn. We'll just slowly build that color and texture. And while we let the top of that acorn dry, I'm just going to add in some watery orange, just keeping up that vibrancy. Just kind of softening a few of those edges, and then letting all those layers dry. Now I'm just going to mix a little of my Moonglow and burnt sienna to kind of create a deeper brown. And I'm going back in and adding a little bit of shadow in the texture of the acorn. This is where we're just continuing to build that dimension. Some areas we go a little bit darker and some areas we go softer and lighter. The areas that are more highlighted, you see more of that texture, and then as it goes around the acorn, it gets a little more diffused looking. So we can still go dark, but our lines will just be a little softer, a little fuzzier looking. Kind of always continuing adding a little more into that shadow. Our inspiration photo is a little overlit, probably over edited, so it doesn't really show that shadow like this, but really to create that 3D look, we need to kind of veer off from our inspiration photo, add in that nice deep shadow under the acorn. Now we're going to start working on the stem and the leaf. I realized here I added way too much water, so I'm just going to tap that out and kind of start over. My first layer is going to be an olive green. Just letting that first layer spread in there softly. Then I'm going to add a little bit of orange to kind of melt in there, kind of create that first layer of interest. I'm going to pre-wet my first leaf. We're just going to work on one leaf at a time. I'm just putting in a watery layer of the olive green. I'm going to make that olive green a little more concentrated, kind of dropping it in a few little areas to create a look of shadow. Bringing in some of my sap green. Really like the first layer to kind of have more than one color in it because it really does create a nice base layer. I'm going to bring in just a little raw sienna, just kind of drop it in a few places. Now we let that first leaf dry. Now we're going to work on the second one, doing the same technique, just getting it fully wet. So our first layer can be wet on wet. Now while the second leaf is drying, we're going to start working on our first leaf. I'm kind of doing a technique here where I'm just kind of painting around where I want the veining to stay light. So I'm just kind of working in those darker areas. Not really worrying about detail, but I am kind of using my brush in a way that kind of creates a little bit of a look of texture. Now while it's still wet, I'm just going to drop in a little bit of that sap green, kind of create a little more dimension. I want that first leaf to fully dry so I can work on the second leaf. And we're just going to do the same technique. We're just going to kind of add in our darker color, our second layer. We're just going to leave the veining that original underpainting. I had my leaf veins drawn out. They've kind of faded, so I'm just, as I'm painting, I'm just kind of trying to figure out a little bit where that veining is. I'm not copying the inspiration photo leaf, so I don't really have to worry about it looking exact. It kind of takes that pressure off of something looking perfect and exactly like an inspiration photo. We're here to learn and to express ourselves, and our inspiration photo is there to just kind of be a guideline. But if I start painting where I'm trying to make it exact, it creates a level of stress, and that is not what I am going for. Hopefully you aren't either. So I'm just kind of doing the best I can here, just building my color, building a little depth. Now we're just going to kind of continue adding shadow. I'm going to add in a little more detail using that Moonglow. I'm using my small #1 brush to add in this detail. Gives me a little more control. And I'm just taking some of that Moonglow, creating a little more shadow on the top of the acorn. It's really helping to create that dimension and detail. I realize my two leaves kind of mesh together a little too much, so I'm just bringing in a little highlight by wetting down my leaf with some clean water and just kind of tapping it out. So now that front leaf kind of pops out a little bit more from the leaf behind. I'm going to bring in my Micron waterproof pen in 005. It's a very fine tip pen. I just like adding in little bits of detail. I almost scribble. I'm not really trying to outline anything. I'm just adding in little bits here and there to kind of add a little more dimension into my painting. If you're really uncomfortable doing this part, then just feel free to leave it out. I just like to add in just this little extra detail. I'm just putting it in a few places. I'm not outlining everything. Now it's time to add the shadow underneath our acorns. I'm just going to add in a little water first because I want my shadow to kind of blend in there really softly. We can build the depth of the shadow as we go. Just bringing in my Moonglow, and you'll kind of see as it spreads, it's kind of a purpley gray with a little bit of blue in there. It just makes a wonderful shadow. Going to soften it a little bit with a little more water. I don't want our shadow to look too harsh. After our shadow dries, this is the very last thing we're going to do on our painting is I'm taking an X-Acto knife and I'm just kind of scraping in a little bit of highlight in my acorn to add the last of the dimension. I'm not going very deep, I'm just scraping off a little layer. Now I'm using a pretty good paper that holds up really well to this kind of technique. And one of the things you need to think about is this really is the last step. Once you kind of scrape out some of that color, you can't go back over it with water. It will turn into a big mess. So that's why I save this till the very end. And if this technique makes you a little nervous and you are afraid of ruining your painting, you could either leave it out or just take a little test watercolor paper and just give it a little try before you do it on your main painting. And part of doing this is to learn these techniques and to get more familiar with them. But I think if you just start slow and just try a little bit, I think you'll find that you really enjoy implementing some of these techniques. I'm just going to do a little bit in my leaf, not too much, just adding in a few little highlights. And there you have it, your finished 3D acorns. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that I'll get to see you on the next one. Happy painting!